Today, I've got the chance to sit down with the EU sanctions envoy, David O'Sullivan, to discuss really how sanctions are going. David, welcome to the Suspicious Transaction Report.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So we're going to dive straight in. Your role's a recent addition to the kind of EU's diplomatic capacity. So tell us about the origin of your role, why it was created, and more importantly, what tempted you back to Brussels?
Well, I think the idea was that heading into 1 year of sanctions, and I think at that point 9 packages, there was growing recognition that the issue of circumvention and particularly outreach to those countries who had not aligned on our sanctions was going to be an important part of our work. And frankly, the people dealing with sanctions were overworked, didn't have the bandwidth to deal with that, so they wanted to bring somebody in extra, and they turned to me.
You obviously had a long kind of history in Brussels prior to that. So what were your first impressions when you came back here?
Well, I mean, I never left Brussels, actually. When I retired from Washington, I retired to Brussels, and I've been living here ever since. But I hadn't really followed very closely what the Commission and the External Action Service were up to on sanctions. And my first impression was genuine respect and admiration for what people had managed to do in a relatively short period of time. I mean, I had dealt with sanctions previously when I was in the External Action Service with Cathy Ashton. We'd worked a lot on the Iran sanctions, so I had some familiarity. And frankly, what people had succeeded in doing, even in those first 8 months, 9 months of the after the invasion, was just remarkable. I would never have believed that we could have adopted sanctions of that intensity in that space of time. It was really, the people have been working very hard and achieved a lot.
So as you mentioned, there were kind of 9 packages had already been put in place by that point. So what was in your in-tray when you arrived? Because as you say, you were hired or brought back to Brussels for a very specific reason. So kind of what was in your in-tray and what was your perspective as you started to sort of leaf through that?
Well, 2 things really. The first was the analysis already done very expertly by the Commission colleagues on the trade flows which generated a list of countries where we had reason to believe there might be circumvention. So basically looking at the products previously exported to Russia, which were now being exported in largish quantities to other countries and from those countries to Russia. So this generated a first list of kind of a to-do list of countries to visit, right? And secondly, to coordinate closely with the international coalition, the G7 plus, particularly the US and the UK, who were particularly active and who've been very supportive. And part of my work has been to work very closely with them. And some of the visits I've done to third countries have been jointly, either with the 3 of us or just the Americans or just the UK, which has always been extremely helpful.
So I want to come to the list of countries you mentioned in a second, but I've always been quite curious because we see the press releases that, David O'Sullivan's going here and someone from the US Treasury is going there. Do you all sort of crowd into the meeting room with the opposite numbers in these countries together, or do you sort of take it in turns to go in? How does that work, choreography?
Well, I mean, when we travel jointly, we try to organize joint meetings. I mean, it's easier for the other country, but frankly, it is for the third country to dictate, and 1 or 2 have preferred us to meet separately. So sometimes, literally, they've had to sit there for a whole day while the UK traipse in, then the EU traipse in, then the US traipse in. We believe we're all saying the same thing to the same people, but sometimes people prefer not to have to deal with us as a large group.
Well, there's an interesting dynamic there, and again, we'll come on to this because, of course, the EU has certain things that it can offer these countries which perhaps the US doesn't in terms of trade relations and existing relations. But I make that as an observation. We'll come back to it. So let's talk about the list of countries. Our OSullivan tracking system has you popping up in all sorts of places. I mean, what are you sort of aspiring to achieve from those diplomatic engagements?
Well, I mean, we did this first, and it's a relatively crude index, right? You take sort of gross trade flows of sanctioned products, and then you see where does the trade which previously went to Russia now seem to be heading, and that generates, as I say, a list of countries where we would like to open a conversation with them. There's a Tolstoy quote that all countries which have aligned on our sanctions are aligned for the same reason, which is solidarity with Ukraine and opposition to Russia's unprovoked aggression. Everyone who is not aligned does it for their own reasons, right? The reason why Kazakhstan is not aligned is not the same as why Turkey is not aligned, or why Serbia or the UAE is not aligned. So your starting point always has to be full respect and understanding of the sovereignty of these countries. They're sovereign countries. They've made certain choices. You have to assume that they've done so en pleine connaissance de cause, that they have good reason. And then the starting point is basically, well, you're not aligned, but we assume you don't particularly want to be a platform for circumvention. And the answer to that has unequivocally, in all the countries I've been to, saying no, absolutely not. We don't want to adopt your sanctions because we only adopt UN sanctions, or because we feel we are in a geographically difficult position. But we don't want to be a platform for circumvention. And that's the opening. And then I come with the numbers and I say, well, have you looked at these trade figures, and have you seen that indeed there is strong evidence that there is stuff going through your country? And that we start from there. And of course, we decided very early on at the G7, and particularly also with the Japanese colleagues and the Ukrainian colleagues, to focus on a sub-list of sanctioned products, which we know would go directly into Russian military kit, which the Ukrainians were finding on the battlefield. And while this was not economically hugely important, it was obviously very important for the purposes of undermining Russia's ability to conduct this war. And this is a very powerful narrative, even with countries who do not wish to be politically aligned in this conflict.
So you show them some numbers, which, notwithstanding the data is a bit crude, I'm sure you're confident in those numbers. I mean, what do? Do they look at their shoes or do they reject the data? How do they react to that?
No, I think sometimes they're genuinely surprised because in many of these countries they didn't necessarily have systems which collected data in real time or in even at regular intervals. I think they were genuinely curious to understand, and then they would also once they would say, well, even assuming this is true, very often it's, your countries are choosing to export these goods. We don't know who these operators are, if they're re-exporting to Russia. Maybe you need to be more careful with your own exporters. And indeed, I do echo this very strongly with member states every time I speak, which is that anti-circumvention starts at home. And we do have a lot of homework, and we've been doing a lot, which we can talk about if you want to at some point. But then the argument goes to, well, don't you think you might want to help us in preventing some of this circumvention and this traffic through your country, particularly as it relates to goods which we know find their way into Russian missiles, Russian drones, Russian artillery shells. And that's where the conversation tends to become more focused. I can also say a number of the countries actually were in the process of putting in place more sophisticated data monitoring systems, mainly for tax or customs purposes. But I think it was in Kazakhstan and even in Uzbekistan, they actually were able to show us new systems they were developing, not for the purpose of sanctions, but they were more than happy to cooperate in data sharing, which is already a good start for a discussion.
So we hope that the data opens their eyes. We hope that they recognize the brutality of the war in Ukraine. But of course, you probably have to lean into the conversation sometimes. So what can the EU offer these countries to encourage them, if you like, to take the issue of circumvention more seriously?
Well, I mean, you have to look at any discussion when you turn up in these countries, and I turn up as the sanctions envoy, but of course you cannot ignore the general context. What are the trade relations? Do we have other issues? Do we give development assistance? What are the kind of things that they hope to achieve in their relationship with Europe? So you have to know that, and I never explicitly link the sanctions discussion to the rest, because I don't have the power to do that, to be very frank, and it's not the way we work. But I always do emphasize, look, we have a positive agenda. There are things we want to do together. Let's try and not make the sanctions an irritant or an obstacle to that development. There are also things where intrinsically we can sometimes help, because maybe as a result of some of the consequences, they might have money trapped somewhere, or they might have, things that they need, and we can try and then obviously we're going to be helpful helpful where we can. I mean, it is a dialogue. It's at the end of the day, they retain the sovereign right to help or not to help, and therefore it is much more an effort of persuasion than it is one of forcing people to do things.
So you mentioned that the countries that aren't aligned, that are facilitating, knowingly or otherwise, circumvention, have sort of different reasons for their non-alignment. So could you give us some examples of why countries might be in the position they are in? Because obviously,
well, I mean, you'd need to ask the countries. But if I look at it, take just two examples that come readily to mind. Two candidate countries that have not aligned, Turkey and Serbia. They have very different motivations. I mean, I think in the case of Turkey, I would respectfully say that this is about Mr. Erdogan's wish to be a global statesman, to be a mediator, to keep equidistance between the Western and other blocs. I think in the case of Serbia, it's very much a folk memory of their own experiences, of sanctions, and of the conflicts and the NATO bombings of the 90s, plus a certain affinity for Russia, which we know exists there. So, but it's a very different motivation. If you move to Central Asia, one obvious reason is simply their geographical proximity to Russia and their heavy dependence on Russia economically. Many of them have migrant workers who are substantially present in Russia and on whose remittances their economy depends. So, you know, it's always, everyone has a different profile, everyone has a different reason, but they all arrive at the same conclusion, which is they don't want to align with our sanctions, but they don't want to be, neither do they wish to be a platform for circumvention and sanctions evasion, because that also has reputational consequences for these countries. And I think they understand that if they get a reputation of being a place where bad things are being done on circumvention, they're at the risk of secondary sanctions or even of listings of entities, and this is not good for their future economic development. So they're juggling, in fairness to all these countries, they're juggling a number of different and sometimes conflicting objectives.
You mentioned secondary sanctions. Obviously, the background against which you make these visits changes over time as new packages are introduced. The 11th package moved in this sort of direction of secondary sanctions. Dare I say it, the Americanization of EU sanctions. I know this is a very unpopular phrase in this town, but maybe you could just sort of talk to us about then how do those conversations develop? Because as I say, there are more tools in the EU toolbox now than there were when you started.
Yes, there are. But I mean, I want to be very clear. We were joking, but there is no appetite on the European side to move to extraterritorial sanctions. And this is a clear position of our member states. And we would argue that all the additional measures which we have put in place don't cross that threshold. I've spent a lot of my career sort of arguing against the extraterritoriality of US sanctions. Sometimes I get a bit envious in this role, but that's our clear position. But we have equipped ourselves with a number of options to basically list or to target entities who we feel are facilitating circumvention. And this is not so much governments as economic actors. So we have the possibilities offered under Annex 4 of the dual use regulation, which is, I would say, not a sanction, strictly speaking, because we simply prohibit European companies from doing business with these companies, but it does deprive them of access to the raw material of circumvention. The second is, and this was an innovation of the 11th package, building on previous packages, we do have the possibility directly to sanction, so to freeze the assets and to affect the business model of entities whom we are convinced are actively facilitating circumvention without there having to be a link with a proven criminal conviction of a European company, which was the previous condition for that. So this is an additional element of flexibility that we have. And finally, we've adopted in the 11th package something called the anti-circumvention mechanism, such as our love of easy-to-understand terms. But this basically enables us to block the export to countries or to block the export to countries or to block the export of to block the export of products to countries or of a single product to several countries. So to play with between countries and products, it is something that we have not yet used. Member states were cautious about agreeing to it and have attached a number of conditions to it. I have no doubt we will use it at some point, but we're not there yet. But this again, I never like to feel I make threats, but I don't even have to tell people I'm talking to that these methods exist. They know it, and they obviously want to avoid a situation where we get into using too many of these possibilities.
Speak softly and carry a big stick. Now, you mentioned economic actors. A lot of the work that we do is engaging with the private sector because ultimately they are the ones that are facilitating circumvention or selling products that they shouldn't sell. So what sort of engagement do you have with the private sector when you go and visit these third countries?
We always meet with the private sector. We also do a lot of technical assistance, I should say. We've had missions in Turkey. We've had missions in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. There's currently one in Kyrgyzstan. So we do seek to explain to the private sector how our sanctions work, what their liabilities might be. Also, by the way, the liabilities of any European citizens working in those private sector companies. And that's particularly relevant, for example, in the UAE, where there are many expat Europeans employed, because all European citizens are potentially criminally liable, personally liable, if they were to participate in facilitating sanctions evasion. So we do work a lot with the private sector to explain to them. They always have lots of questions. Obviously, the financial sector in particular is very nervous, also because of the risk of U.S. secondary sanctions. So, I mean, the fact that we are doing this jointly with the U.S. extends the panoply of risk for actors in these countries. So we do use that as well. That it's not just a conversation that they're having with the EU or just a conversation with the US or the UK, but it's a conversation with all three. And so they have to watch the measures which are available to all three of us.
I have this image of you all kind of huddled in passport control, deciding who's going to go hard on which point when you arrive at these countries. But that does open, I guess, an important question, which is around coordination. I mean, I think outsiders who watch this have been impressed by the way in which the G7 plus have coordinated on sanctions. So perhaps could you give us a sense of how that coordination works? Because everyone has different powers and regimes and interests to bring to the table.
Yeah, no, the coordination is excellent, I have to say. I mean, it really has impressed me. I mean, first of all, we make every effort to make sure that we're as aligned as possible on the sanctions, even though, as you say, we have different regimes and different powers and instruments at our disposal. But we tic-tac a lot we share data, we share analysis. I mean, so particularly if we're visiting a country, we make sure we all have the same basic understanding of what the issues are, what the priorities are, what the priority ask will be with that particular country. We work, we interact very regularly with my counterparts in the State Department, in the FCO, and more widely, we've organized twice now a forum here in Brussels, the International Coordinators Forum, where we bring all the main actors of the G7 plus together. We share the data, we share analysis. So no, we work very closely together, and I must say, I cannot speak too highly of the effort, genuine effort of coordination by everyone, and particularly, I would say, the US and the UK colleagues whom we work very closely with.
So just one last question on third countries. Have you been to China or India yet? Are we likely to see those as destinations?
I am planning a trip to India at the beginning of December, yeah. I have not been asked to go to China yet, though obviously China is a country of interest in this regard. But our focus has been on what the statistics revealed in the first phase, which was basically countries mostly in the region. But one of the things we will see, and we are seeing, is an evolution in the patterns of circumvention, particularly as some of the countries we visited do shut down some of the circumvention, particularly on the battlefield goods. We are seeing new patterns of evasion emerge, and that may require us to move further afield.
And the data really allows you to see that, if not in real time, but the weeks that follow visits?
Fairly rapidly, yes. I mean, it depends. There are some countries where data is fairly readily available. There are some countries where it's less regularly published. But I must say, I'm extremely impressed with the work which has been done within the Commission, particularly by the colleagues in DG Trade and the customs people. They've done fantastic work. And we do now have an analytical capacity which is far superior today than it was even, say, when I started in January. Also, information on companies and intermediaries and actors, the economic actors who are actually involved in some of this stuff. So we are becoming increasingly granular in our analytical capacity, and this is very helpful.
So in years to come, people will be studying the data, and there will be the O'Sullivan effect on trade flows in Central Asia and elsewhere. I want to turn to the home front. Obviously, not a primary focus of your responsibilities, but of course, when it comes to products that end up in weapons being used by the Russians that come from Europe, the starting point is Europe, and the circumvention just facilitates that. So how does that conversation going in the context of trying to disrupt circumvention at source?
Well, I think this is very important, and member states are very active, and we work very closely. DG FISMA, which is the Financial Services DG, but which has the responsibility for implementation of sanctions, works very closely with individual member states to figure out, how they're doing, what challenges they face. But it's very good that we've been able to share with the member states the data as to the companies who are exporting. And what we've done is we've encouraged them. And frequently it's not many companies, Tom. This is the point. You look at the totality of economic activity in a given country like Germany, and you think, well, where do you begin? But the answer is actually, it's not, 10,000 companies. It's maybe, 24 or 50. But member states are increasingly able to identify these companies, reach out to them, give them advice, encourage them, warn them about the risks they run, and we're already seeing some prosecutions of people who've been found guilty of, or at least accused of, sanctions evasion. But more importantly, to encourage companies to do due diligence and to equip them to ask the right questions when they suddenly get orders from countries where they never sold before, maybe from a company that was only created after the Russian invasion. So we can equip them with the elements to do the due diligence work and to avoid that they become unwittingly victims of a circumvention scam. The other point we have to be aware of, nonetheless, is that particularly for the battlefield goods, there's a lot of stuff out there that was maybe exported even long before the war began. So it's European, but it's been sitting in some warehouse in some country or a distributor somewhere who suddenly discovers this is now quite valuable, and then they start selling it on. So it's not all the fault of the companies in Europe who have been selling, since the war. But it is also true that they do have particular responsibility, and I think being able to identify those critical actors is an important part of the fight against circumvention.
So I want to go back to a point you were making there, because obviously banks are steeped in sanctions compliance and have been fined and engaged with this topic for years and years and years. There are industries across Europe for whom this is their first experience of sanctions. So can you say any more about how we are helping those companies? Because we can't expect them to hire 10 people to do sanctions compliance. What tools are available to them?
Well, I mean, the primary responsibility there is member states, because this is where the responsibility for enforcement lies. But I think increasingly we are in touch with industrial intermediaries, representative groups of industry. Member states reach out to their own industry to, as I say, help them understand what are the red flags they need to look for, what are the questions they should be asking. I mean, it's not rocket science, let's be honest. You may be a very small company, but if you used to sell to Russia and you suddenly get a big request from a country very near Russia that you've never sold to before, and you look up the company and you discover the company was created in February 22, I mean, you might want to ask yourself a few questions as to what is the real need for this product, for this company, and what do they intend to do with it. So I think there's a growing recognition amongst even the smallest of companies that this is what they have to do. You
would indeed hope so. Now, when you first came into the role, and when we first had the chance to speak, I think back in January, the word of 2023, I think everyone thought was going to be implementation. Maybe it was anti-circumvention, as we've been talking about here. Looking ahead into 2024, what's going to be the word of 2024? I don't want to lead the witness, but your last answer kind of perhaps gave me a clue.
Well, I think it is intensification of the implementation and the enforcement. I think enforcement is important because we have to demonstrate the seriousness, and therefore I do encourage member states, when they find people who are guilty of circumvention, to demonstrate publicly that this has consequences. But I think that the main focus is going to be continuously on making it harder, slower, and more expensive for Russia to circumvent. We will never completely eliminate circumvention, but we have to consistently shut down as many of the circuits of circumvention as we can, always making it harder, making it more complicated, and ultimately making it more expensive, so that, yes, Russia will continue to receive some of this stuff, but it's going to be less predictable when they get it. They're going to have to pay much more for it, and they're constantly they're quite ingenious in inventing channels of circumvention, but that we're going to keep testing them to coming up with new ones as we shut off current ones. And I think that's going to be the big challenge of next year.
When you see the FSB getting sanctioned for its activities by the Americans in particular, you realize how critical actually sanctions evasion is to Russia. You're absolutely right. I wanted just to pick up the enforcement thread a little bit, because right now, if you sit in Europe, you're not worried about enforcement from your national competent authority or police or whatever it is. You're worried about enforcement from across the Atlantic. So how are we going to get people to be concerned about?
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, in all the member states, whenever I'm not responsible for relations with the member states for implementation. That's Commissioner McGuinness and the colleagues in DG FISMA. But I do get round to quite a number of member states because I like to understand how they see it. Also, it enables me to explain a bit better what I'm doing. And I always meet with the investigative authorities, the prosecutorial authorities, and I can tell you they're very active. They're very active, and many of them have a lot of ongoing investigation. And I think we are going to see a considerable uptick in prosecutions and in pursuing people who have been guilty of sanctions evasion. So I don't think people could be in any way complacent that member states are not pursuing this. Quite the contrary. I think most member states are taking it very seriously, and as I say, it takes a little bit of time because there's due process, there's investigations, and let's face it, people have a lot of other responsibilities. I mean, if you look at the customs people, for example, they're also looking at drugs and terrorism, and so I don't underestimate the pressure which is on the law enforcement agencies, but in all the member states I've been to, they have made it very clear that they have received instructions to put sanctions evasion way up there with the top priorities.
So we're coming to a close, but there are a couple of short questions I wanted to ask to finish up on. The first one is the question of sanctions effectiveness. We hear that sanctions are effective. You have, I think, been very realistic by saying, look, we're trying to slow the ability, we're trying to make it more expensive and so on. What would you point to? What have you seen that demonstrates that kind of sanctions are having an impact, and the pain that EU economies are potentially feeling because of sanctions has been worth it?
Well, I think across the three areas where we have wanted to impose heavy costs on Russia, one is we can point to success. I think on the denying Russia access to the technology needed to produce sophisticated weapons, I think we can see they're turning to Iran, they're turning to North Korea, and they are struggling. And the evidence is that much of what they're putting on the battlefield is less sophisticated, less effective than it was. And of course, the Ukrainian colleagues are equipped with the latest NATO stuff. So they do have a certain technological advantage on the battlefield, which was one of our objectives. In terms of revenue, I think that Russia has suffered enormously. The UK colleagues estimate that maybe there's as much as 400 billion euros that would have been available to Russia that is not as a result of the sanctions. Their public spending is suffering. They are forced to spend an increasing proportion of public spending on defense. About 30% of public spending is now on defense, and I think, I don't, there are differing estimates, but they're spending somewhere between 6, 8, maybe even 9% of GDP on defense. I mean, this is a huge drag on your economy because you're cannibalizing your economy. You're taking stuff out of the productive sector and pushing it into the unproductive military sector. And in terms of the future industrial development, 1,000 Western companies have left Russia. They have had a huge outflow of talented young people. There's a massive labor shortage. There is no new investment. I mean, do you know any company that's planning a big investment in Russia anytime soon? So this is really, imposing a massive cost on the Russian economy. I mean, I've said in the past, it's a slow puncture rather than a blowout. And that is where I am realistic, and I admit that there is a slight disconnect between the time needed for this to have its impact and what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and the suffering of the Ukrainian people, and that, that's where we then come to other stuff like military assistance, macro economic assistance, or even the more political and supportive element of a perspective of membership of the European Union and opening negotiations. These are other ways in which we can provide moral and political and military support to the Ukrainian people. But sanctions is a very important part, and I do believe that we are progressively squeezing the Russian military-industrial complex in ways which will make a big difference.
And a final question. You've obviously learned an awful lot about sanctions in the last year. And as you said at the beginning, it's a topic that you've followed for many years. What lessons should the EU then take away from this Russia sanctions experience as relates to the kind of other regimes that exist?
Well, I think you'll forgive me for saying that, I personally think having to adopt things by unanimity is not the easiest. There are options in the treaty for changing that. I know there's perhaps not great enthusiasm, but I think wonders have been done, notwithstanding the need for unanimity. But I think if we're honest, unanimity, the need for unanimity has also made it increasingly difficult. I think the other thing that we do need to think about is the fact that the implementation is at national level. There are many derogations, exceptions, possibilities of granting licenses and so forth, which are done at the national level. Now, I don't think there's any ill will there, but you ask 27 different administrations to interpret you risk to get different opinions. And I hear from industry that they would very much like a one-stop shop for deciding the derogations, the exceptions, and so forth. Now, what that would look like institutionally, we certainly would need to talk about, and I think there would be lots of sensitivities about transferring competences to the EU level and so forth. But I think this is one area where, at the level of the implementation of sanctions, that's something we need to think about for the future. But I think it's very important in this current context not to get distracted by these future improvements from the job in hand, which is, of pressing urgency in relation to what is happening and the horror that is unfolding in Ukraine.
Certainly in the work that we do in our CIFRNet project, harmonization is a desire that the private sector would love to see, because as you rightly say, it's a very complex and fragmented landscape. David, it's been an absolute pleasure having you. Good luck with your travels. We will continue to monitor your movements around the world, and let's hope that next time we talk, we have many more countries aligned with the sanctions with us here in the EU.
Thank you very much indeed.